And let me know when you see the presenter slides.
I see your screen.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. So this is a talk I've made about a client that we had a while back that we needed to make an easy way for them to manage a bunch of websites. I believe it was somewhere over 100. I think I've lost count at this point. But I decided to make a talk about building Drupal websites en masse. So my name is James Nettik. I'm a senior developer manager here at Atten Design Group. I've been doing Drupal development for over 10 years, I think 11 years now at this point, and then 6 of those have been with Atten. So when thinking about managing dozens of websites all at the same time and thinking about how they need to be organized, what are some of the challenges that we need to come up with, and what is sort of the mindset we need to have when we go into that? As the notorious BIG possibly said, more websites is more problems. So the starting guidelines is we do want to try and keep the scope as small and as simple as possible. And that's not always going to be possible depending on the nature of the websites. As they grow in complexity, we're going to be adding new features, and scope just always kind of continually grows, especially as we add more websites. But I think one of the key guiding principles is this: the question we always return to is when somebody's asking for a feature, and it's always going to be one website that's like, we need this, and it's just going to be for us. Try to think of a way that it's going to benefit every other website that's on the platform. Because the thing is once you release it, managing sort of bespoke features per website becomes even more tedious. But if you can sort of release it as a feature that you can turn on or turn off, it makes it a lot more manageable. And it's going to be one of those things that inevitably you're always going to have to test not only how it's going to affect every website once you roll it out to that new feature, but also how that new feature is going to impact the install. So testing is another big starting guideline of this, making sure you get into the practice of not only testing against existing websites, but then testing freshly spun up websites or testing a fresh install. Drupal itself kind of lends itself to being able to do this pretty effectively. And it does that with a few different conventions. The first one, which is built right into core, is this idea of an installation profile. So an installation profile is, Drupal core ships with their own right off the bat. There's the standard profile. There's one I can't remember the name of. It's the very stripped down one. And then there's the umami profile that sort of is a much more fleshed out profile that gives you a real demo of what Drupal does. But essentially an installation profile is a module-esque structure that comes bundled with module dependencies. It can come with content types, pre-configured, some default pages or default themes that you want to start a new project with. These are generally used as a good starting point for new projects. And I think it's a pretty common practice for people to start developing their own installation profiles just for their own development purposes, because they're really good at speeding up initial development. I think every time we start a new project, we always have, well, I want to work with this suite of modules. I'm always going to build, these content types, these image styles. And so just automating these things so you don't have to, spend hours or sometimes even days reconfiguring the same things really helps speed up our initial development and lower budgets on projects. One of the downsides is we don't tend to really re-release new features to install profiles, especially on a more per project basis. So we're not going to update all of our projects necessarily with an installation profile. But what Drupal does have is this idea of a distribution. And that's essentially an installation profile that we've contributed back to the community. These are items that do receive functionality updates and new features periodically. I think really good examples of that are Acquia's Lightning distribution. And I believe there's the Thunder distribution. There was at one point Commerce Kickstart. So distributions are a thing that have been around in Drupal for a while. Outside of that initial install and the functionality, one of the challenges to also solve is how you want to handle default content and to what extent you want default content in on the website. I think you can kind of take 2 frames of thought with that. One is how you either want a completely bare site that people have to build up from scratch. The downside of that is it's maybe sometimes hard, especially for new users to the system, to really know how to start filling out the content of their website. The other is giving them sort of a pre-built website with content with the intent that they're going to go in, click edit, and start changing the content. And that's the approach that we took for the client that we built this upstream for. We use that, or we solve that using the default content module. What this does is it provides a list of commands in Drush, and it lets you export all of your site content into the custom modules that you'd be installing. So you can organize things however you want, store all of those files in a module, and then when those modules get installed, so long as they have a dependency on default content, it creates all of those content, and it manages all of the references. So media, paragraphs, users, all of those things get installed. In the case of files, so if you have PDFs or images that you also want to make sure installed, or that you also want to make sure get created, the default content module actually embeds them inside of the JSON files that it exports. So you don't have to worry about managing those assets. Those are just encoded into the files and get created on the fly. What that looks like in practice is a structure like this. So inside of our module, in this case, it's our SP Core default pages module, there's going to be a folder called content. And then within that, there's going to be a folder for every entity type that's going to be created. Now, one of the things you're seeing here is sort of an early attempt of mine to maybe more organize some of the files. By default, when you export things, you're going to see the UUID as the name of the JSON file. And since UUIDs aren't exactly super intuitive for me to read, essentially, I had the idea of like renaming some of these pages or some of these files based on the content that it was creating. What I found in practice is that became really difficult to maintain as we were updating content and making changes. And so I kind of ultimately decided I didn't necessarily need to be really worrying about that all that much, and it became a convention that I quickly moved away from as we went on the life of this build. But like I said, these are just JSON files that get installed so long as they're in the correct directory. Another challenge, though, is going to be updating existing content. So for this suite of projects, or the suite of websites that we were working on, what they really wanted to be able to do is control messaging across the entire platform as much as possible. They wanted a bit more of a top-down approach that says, like if we, a good example, this was a client that works in the medical field, and when everything started happening with COVID, they needed to make sure they had statements and information provided for all of their websites on how they're handling a lot of the precautions. And so what we were able to do is, using this platform, deploy to all 100 plus of their websites a statement on the homepage that basically outlined what they were doing and what their were doing as far as precautions. So that's one of the limitations of the default content module, is it doesn't allow you to necessarily update existing content. It just lets you create it on the fly once you've created the website for the first time. So what we can do, though, is rely on the UIDs that are created for all of the content when default content imports what it does. And then we can leverage those to update the content on existing websites, then making sure that at the end of, once we're done with that, we go back and we update the default content exports. So any new websites to the platform also get these changes in messaging. So the approach that I took for that is, we have a folder in there called update files, and this just contains the HTML for any of the updates that we're making, and those are named after the update hooks that we run. And then in the .install file for the module, we can take two approaches. In this case, what we're doing is updating an existing piece of content. So we find the UID of the specific page that we want to add, or we want to update. And for this project, we do leverage paragraphs for a lot of the content. So we get our in the for each there, we get the content field, we loop over all of the values, we load that paragraph specifically, we make sure it has the correct field, making some assumptions about if it has this field, it's the kind of the type of content that we need. And then we do the same thing, we loop over that. And in this case, what we actually needed to do was fix a spelling error we noticed that existed in all of the content. We had misspelled surgical in some of the default content. So it was super simple to loop over all the content and then just do a find and replace for any of the misspellings. And the nice thing is since we were operating from a default content, we knew it was misspelled the exact same way in the exact same place on every website. So fixing it was fairly straightforward. And then we saved the paragraph and pushed that out. Creating new content is much of the same process. So what we do is we go and we load our content. We first create the paragraph that's going to house that HTML. We save that, and then we create our new node. We give it the, in this case, it's the accessibility statement. We make sure to set the UID. And this is sort of a bit of a dance because it's a bit of a chicken and egg question on, are we going to go with the UID that's created from default paragraphs or default content, or do we sort of define our own? Ultimately, the approach that I took was starting from a fresh website and then in the Drupal interface, went through and created the content as I wanted it and then re-exported that. And then just made sure that when I'm setting this UID here, it matches what was set up on that initial export. So we can go ahead and set the UID. We make sure we assign our paragraph to the content field, and then we save that. And you can go through all sorts of other things that you might want to do in this hook. You can set up path aliases, you can add images or any of the other, anything you can basically do with Drupal's API, you just do an update hook here. So once we sort of have the application built that we're going to be setting up, the next question is, the hosting and infrastructure and how are we actually managing all of these websites? So we landed early on using Pantheon specifically for their upstream functionality. So for anybody who's not familiar with Pantheon or their upstreams, the idea is that you start from a template that usually Pantheon hosts themselves. And it's just a central Git repository. They have some for Drupal 8, Drupal 9. They also have some for WordPress. And anytime a code change is made to that repository, every website that's been spun up on Pantheon using that upstream gets that change through its interface. It's worth mentioning Upstreams can be hosted, I believe, on GitHub, on Bitbucket, on GitLab, and they've also, I think, can to some degree integrate with more custom solutions if you reach out to them and kind of work through them with some of those edge cases. But in our case, we were hosted on Bitbucket. So from a traditional upstream, what you do is if you're a user who's managing a website and a change has been made to an upstream, you'll get this little box that pops up that says there are now updates available. This is from sort of a sandbox website we created a long time ago, which is why it has 3 updates available. But the idea is that all I necessarily need to do from a user perspective is go through, click apply updates, and any of the upstream changes are now going to get pulled down to my website. Database updates get ran, content gets changed if you're doing anything like that, caches get cleared, but you're not reliant on a developer or anybody technical to roll out changes to your platform of websites. Anybody who has access to the Pantheon dashboard can apply those. And the nice thing is anybody who has access to the Pantheon dashboard can also create new websites. So it kind of removes the developer from the equation altogether for maintaining a lot of these. And that's sort of what they were looking for with this solution. In this case, organizations can also create their own upstreams, and that's what we built for this client. But in the case of Atom, we maintain a few ourselves for just how we manage or how we work with websites on Pantheon. So what you can do here is see your upstreams, see a list of anything that you manage, and all you need to do is click the create site from upstream, and you get a new website. One of the downsides that we kind of ran into was it's nice for the non-technical users to be able to go in and manage their websites directly. But in the case of wanting to roll out messaging around safety measures during a pandemic, we don't necessarily want to rely on 100 some different institutions to make sure that they've updated their websites. We want to make sure that every website has the latest and greatest that we've rolled out to the platform. Pantheon offers a CLI tool called Terminus, which lets you manage all of the websites that you have on Pantheon through a command line. It does still have one limitation in the sense that you're still working on websites individually. So you run Terminus, the name of the website, and you can do drush commands or custom Terminus commands that basically mimic functionality on Pantheon. So if you want to deploy code across environments or spin up new multi-dev environments, you can do that easily, but you can't by default affect multiple websites. But what Terminus does do is allow you to build its own plugins. So Pantheon comes with a bunch of plugins that have been built both by themselves and by the community at large. And the one that I was really interested in is that one right in the center, which is the mass update command. Applying upstream updates to a list of websites sounds exactly like what we need to be able to do. And so we took that convention and we kind of ran with that to not only make it for doing mass updates, but for extending a lot of what Terminus offers. So being able to run drush commands sort of in mass across all of the websites. One thing that they wanted to be able to do was periodically audit all of their websites to see which users were available and which modules were enabled, things like that. And so we created a series of custom drush commands that we can leverage per website, and then using our Terminus plugin, we sort of audit all of the websites, and that gets spit out to a CSV. But if we wanted to roll out an update and make sure all the updates are there, essentially what this would look like from the command line perspective is something like this. So you run the command, it goes out, it fetches all of the websites. In this case, it's 105, and then it just kind of loops over them and finds any of the updates that needs to be made and applies them to dev. And then we'd rerun this command per environment to deploy from dev to test and then test to live, and periodic allow for testing at each stage. So that's, I think, the gist of what I got as far as the overall presentation, but I'm very curious to see if there's any questions or anything anybody wants to know about managing your own custom upstreams.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate the lightning talk. I do have a question here. If there's anybody with some questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Happy to take any questions that you have. Question is, you might turn on your video?
Oh, yeah. There we go. Sorry about that.
Yes, a question is can I deploy? Can I just deploy an update to a range of websites, or do I have to deploy it to all of the websites in the upstream?
Yeah. Yes, as long as you have sort of them grouped. What Pantheon does allow you to do is tag individual websites. So the tagging system is entirely up to you. But when you're running those commands, you basically specify which tag you want to apply as well as the upstream. So as long as you sort of have those ranges defined ahead of time, absolutely.
All right, awesome. Oh, I see a question came in from David Needham in the chat, but David, I know you work for Pantheon. So yeah, David is a friend of Atten's. He was on our webinar talking about Pantheon, I believe Pantheon, the Pantheon workflow. Have you actually checked out the autopilot feature? That's new, isn't it?
I have not checked it out. I was actually just looking through that right now.
Yeah, David, Mr. Needham, who's asking about this, I just want to point out we just got our invite to autopilot like on Tuesday, so we've been a little bit busy.
And I'll also say in terms of upstreams as well, I've noticed, especially with Drupal 9 coming out, there's been an update which allows Composer to have more direct access. So you can actually build upstream websites on Pantheon. I think the time we were kind of initially building this, there wasn't necessarily Composer support. So our upstream was deploying the fully built Drupal website. And so I think there's now ways to much more elegantly manage dependencies, both at an upstream level as well as at a per site level. So I'm actually currently exploring that for some further upstream work that we're doing, but I'm looking forward to see how that all works.
Awesome. And just to go back to the tagging system that Pantheon provides for those upstreams, I personally had a follow-up question, which is,
Yeah.
can you apply multiple tags to a single website? So could I say, like, let's say we have a regional client that has, let's say they have learning centers in 3 different states. Can I tag them according to the states, and can I tag them according to like the different groups that they teach? So like, let's say there's different learning centers that are like for grammar school kids or high school kids. Can I apply like to the Joe Crespo Learning Center, Denver high school kids? Could I do multiple tags?
I believe you can. I'm actually just going to double check that to keep myself honest, but tags are essentially something freeform that you apply. So I don't think there's a limitation in how many tags you can add to a project. Let's see.
We've got, David, you are doing the shadow presentation in the chat.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's totally cool. It's totally cool. We have another question. Is, have you considered managing upstream updates within the installation profiles .install file?
So just rather than having them sort of split out inside of other modules, you put them in the main installation profile. We do some of that. I think it really depends on what your architecture is. So for a lot of these projects, we want to make sure that all the websites have their needs met, and some of those needs aren't going to be uniform. Some websites on the platform are going to need maybe content types that others aren't going to need. And so the approach that we take for that is to bundle a lot of those features up into custom modules that anybody managing a specific website can turn on or turn off. And so I think we definitely do updates in like the installation profile.info file or .install file. If it's an update that applies to everything, regardless of what's enabled or isn't. I think what we did do is try to move as much of that functionality to the specific modules where it made the most sense, especially if we have to factor in dependencies, right? Like, does this content type even exist, type of a thing.
Well, there's Stephen who asked the question, said, hey, you could do both module management and config within the profile and module specific updates within the modules themselves.
Yes,